So this today's lecture is part of our lecture series that is hosted by the Repair project at the Department of Anthropology at UVA, and we are very, very glad to welcome Tim Lindgren to today's lecture. He's the special guest today who will be speaking on his experiences of a recently concluded successful project position also. Tim is a postdoctoral researcher with the University of Amsterdam law faculty, and he has been researching especially at the intersections of colonialism, public international law, and environment, and with a very special interest in terms of artistic expressions and performances of international law in informal spaces. Tim has completed his PhD with the Melbourne Law School, which was supported again by the Australian Government Research Training Program Scholarship. And of course, his research has won multiple awards, the PhD at the Melbourne Law School, including the Graduate Research Prize of 2023. One of his latest book chapters that came out, which caught my attention, was this book chapter, which was part of the Routledge Handbook of International Law and the Anthropocentrism, which is titled Grounding Ecocide, Humanity and International Law. And at UVA, Tim is developing, he's now completed the development of a project that theorizes the relationship between place and international law. What is of particular interest to our project, which is the Repair project, is that his project focuses on how diverse understandings of place, but also the agency of the place itself, shapes debates on states' obligations and reparation claims for climate change, with a specific focus on international courts and tribunals. Warm welcome to you. And the biggest thing, the biggest news of the room is that he just got his Marie Curie. So I guess a big round of applause for that, which is going to start in September. Welcome, and you can start.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for that very generous and kind introduction, and of course for the invitation to come and speak with all of you today. And thank you everyone for turning up. This is a slightly different crowd than I usually am in conversation with around these questions. So it's a real privilege to have the opportunity to talk to you and hear from your perspectives as well, and you've also taken the time to be here, and also thank you for pulling together this wonderful project. I mean, I had the chance to be in a conversation with you earlier last year, and there's so many interesting things happening under this project. So from the perspective of international lawyers, the working relationship to these themes, I can say that a lot of people are already paying attention to the project. So I'm looking forward to following it and see where it ends up. In December last year, the International Court of Justice held its hearings for the still ongoing advisory opinion on climate change, or so as it formally is known, obligations of states in respect of climate change. The proceedings are, as some of you perhaps are aware, quite historical for many different reasons, not only because it deals with one of the most monumental and critical issues for our survival on this planet, but also because it concerns long-running legal questions and concerns relating the responsibility for climate change and climate harm, and accordingly then also reparations for these harms under international law. It's perhaps no surprise then that the court received 91 submissions by states and international organizations, which marks a record in the history of the court. Now, beyond these formal submissions, there were also submissions by NGOs, which do not fall within the case file itself, but can be referred to and are considered as publications in the public domain. A particularly interesting submission was filed by Greenpeace International, which at the very first page begins with a poem by a Samoan activist called Okalani Marina. And the poem reads as follows with some omissions. My unborn children will never know the land and sea as I have. The ocean I have been called to protect is poisoned. The cord that tethers me home is tearing. I will fight for you. Remember, I fought for you. Remember that we fought for you. When your roots flourish and the sea sings to you again, remember, pause. And if you're interested in reading the full poem, you can obviously go to the submission, but the title of the poem is also Remember Us. This poem sits as the backdrop for the legal description and the legal arguments that the submission develops about the completely new landscape in international law. The territorial integrity of certain states, which the submission then goes on to argue, are joining a non-human underworld below the surface due to rising sea levels. Now, what I find particularly interesting with this submission is, of course, the legal arguments that it continues to develop later, but also the sense of dissonance or distance between the poem itself and the arguments that the submission proceeds to develop by referring specifically to the international law of territory. So the territories that we wish to say by using what Joseph Slaughter refers to an interlanguage of international law are not really the same thing as the temporally and spatially unbound relationships with place that Mariner's poem evokes. So this dissonance perhaps invites us to really dwell on the following questions. If reparations for climate change ultimately relate to the preservation of land and the sustaining of relationships that people have with it, how does the international law of territory shape what is worth repairing in the very first place? And if reparations, as Olufemi Taiwo has argued, is about the construction of international legal institutions and norms that make a world of fair distribution possible, does the notion of territory then lend itself to such world-making activity? These are questions that I wish to reflect, broadly speaking, on this lecture and hopefully with you after. I'll do this in a slightly roundabout way, however. So in the description of today's event, I promised to offer some preliminary observations on the submissions for their still unfolding advisory opinion. As we did talk about, this falls within a broader project that I have now proposed to set out to do on place and international law, in which I want to trace how international law of territory conceptualizes the environment, but in particular, how different notions of place are evoked in international legal conversations. And see what happens to the development of international law in these particular moments, and if it could lead to more robust state obligations of climate change and environmental harm. As I began to sit down and go through the lecture, I then had the notice that this project is going to get funded for the Marie Curie. So I started to think about how I could frame it in a way that invites you to think with me about certain questions, rather than jumping straight into a set of conclusions. So what I'm going to try to do is to cast kind of a wide net by talking about the process at which that led me to taking these questions seriously in the way that I am, and particularly to pay attention to place as linked to institutional and legal questions, not just cultural backdrops upon which the legal arguments can then be formed. In order to do this, I'll not go directly to reparations under international law, but I want to start by telling two separate but related stories about instances where reparations through law, through an institutional form, are imagined and conceptualized a little bit differently. And the very notion of doing a reparative act is reimagined, at least the way that we understood it under international law. After telling these stories, I'll then make a couple of broader observations on the notion of territory under international law and connect that to this point about reparations. And then we can conclude with a broader description. I'll intentionally be quite light in touch and open for this conversation on reparations, so to bring in your work. And then we can see where the ground lands, or where we land on the ground in some sense. The argument that I develop or want to develop is fairly simple. I argue that a closer legal attention to these two institutional stories shows us the importance of thinking about place rather than the legal terminology of territory when we talk about reparations for climate change and environmental harm under international law, and the way we approach this particular issue in the advisory opinion. Can you hear me in the back, or am I speaking too quietly? Okay, good. A little bit louder. I've had a cold, so I'm kind of like struggling a little bit with the projection. So I'll speak about 40-ish minutes, and then after we can have a conversation, which I think should hopefully work with the format. I'll follow a quite simple structure. So the first part will be, as I noted, one story about the Australian People's Tribunal and my experience there. And then the second story will be about the international rights of nature tribunal. And I'll build on parts of my doctorate here that explored also the question of place in relationship to law, which I'm trying to publish as a monograph separately. 2 points of explanation or perhaps clarification before we get to the different stories. So the first is just to note what one of these what these institutions are that I'm going to lean on a little bit.
You can continue.
Does it work?
No, you can continue.
Thank you. So people's tribunals are tribunals that are organized by civil society actors. They are not sanctioned by states. They can take many different forms and hold different objectives. The perhaps most famous People's Tribunal would be the one here on the slides. This is the Russell Tribunal, organized by the British philosopher Bertrand Russell in 1967. The tribunal tried to hold the United States accountable for war crimes during the Vietnam War by applying international law as they saw fit. So some of these tribunals stay really within a quite strict performance of the kind of doctrinal ways of doing international law to show how it could be applied. Others are much more free in the interpretation, and some even apply their own form of law. The last thing I want to note is that I'm approaching law as an object of study. So I'm not trying to act as the handmaid for the judiciary to resolve a particular problem in the law, as important as that work also is. But I'm rather asking legal questions about the form, substance, and conduct of international law and how it then forms the world we live in. So let's turn to the first story. In this story, I will think with Simone Weil's reliance on attention, and I'm going to use the narrative form to trace the lining of my experience with the Australian People's Tribunal in rural Victoria, which was responding to a drought you can see here on the picture, which was a drying up of a riverbed in the river system caused by sell-off buyouts of water allocation resources to corporate actors focusing on different cash crop adventures. I was traveling rural Victoria to attend Australian People's Tribunal for Community and Nature Rights and its inquiry into the health of the Darling River and Menindee Lakes, as you can see here. Some of the people that spoke here were small-scale farmers, and there was a strange feeling in the air since the loss of arable land concerned land that was stolen in the first place. As First Nation Gorikori poet Evelyn Araluen writes, you ferment myth into the bush and the billabong to give yourself history, and there's enough there to make a man and call him native born. It reminded me of the work of Brenna Banda and also the film title of Laura Portrait's All the Beauty and the Bloodshed. It could be a title for the Australian continent too. More things than the red dust has colored the Australian landscape and turned it into someone's homeland. Other interlocutors came from the Bakanji people, so the indigenous people in this area. They spoke about their own customs and laws and how the drought was not perhaps separate from the history of making a man from the billabong and calling everything else a myth. It's not my place to retell their stories. I'm reminded of Alexis Wright's opening line in the paragraph to Tracker. Writers of stories know that some distances are too great and might never be crossed, and will remain a mystery if the rare thing does not want to be caught, does not want to give up all of its secrets. But reflecting on Bakanji or the Bakanji stories, Wright's opening line felt rather instructive. So the idea of attempting to tell an impossible story is nothing that I should do. I'm not trained in their law and life. I'm trained as an international jurist, and I was there as a visitor. As a visitor, I had, as an international lawyer, some kind of privilege to make the place completely unseen in the language of my law simply by making some gestures to international legal doctrine. I was a visitor with belonging through an association simply through smell and dust, impossible to escape due to the very simple fact that, and here I'm thinking with Jean-Thomas Tremblant, the breeding makes us autopoietic or self-renewing beings. But shared questions about the international law and the tribunal and also reparations were hard to avoid. Was the rights of nature vernacular able to capture what unfolded here at the hearings or in Ara Lewin's poem? And was international law the language needed in order to restore, or should I say repair, the human and non-human relationships in place that had been fractured due to this man-made drought? Or was it international law that made us fail to see what needed to be repaired in the very first place? Was it so that it was trying to get us, in the words of Alexis Wright, closer to the real thing by hunting for the wrong words and telling universalist stories, trying to make us repair the wrong thing in the wrong way with the wrong tools? I don't necessarily have the answers to this as of yet, but one thing was quite clear to me visiting this tribunal. When some of the local inhabitants deployed international law, often without any form of training in international law, they transformed it to their own wishes and not for the purpose of shaping how we read abstract principles, but to develop some kind of law that was useful for them to repair or protect connections that they have with the river, the animals, the people, the air and the dust, everything that made kinship, or should I perhaps say to maintain and protect the continuation of reparative acts being conducted in everyday life in this particular region. So years later, I found myself reading Claire Keegan's Small Things Like This, and I was on my way to the London Conference on International Law. I was drawn to the book when I read the first two lines, which start accordingly. In October, there were yellow trees, then the clocks went back the hour, and the long November winds came in and blew and stripped the trees bare. I rushed off to the conference. It was October. There was no respite in the air. It would be quite some time before the green would turn to yellow, then red and brown as organic matter would die into life in the autumn. The only thing that was yellow still was the grass on the otherwise quite perfectly manicured parks in London, which has been burnt by the heat wave that had been gripping the former metropole of the British Empire, or the former British Empire, that summer. It was a reminder that things were changing also for international law. There was at the same time that in the South Pacific, Tuvalu announced that they would try to set up its sovereignty in a digital format with the metaverse at that point at least. It was also just before the UN General Assembly would proceed to request this advisory opinion on climate change. When I was there, I thought back to the Australian Murray-Darling Basin and to a book, a children's book, by Margaret White, titled The Death of a River. The book illustrates how animals grieve the dying river and how they push back against extraction. And I wanted to go back and ask her if she thought that they did so through some kind of law, and if they did so through some kind of claims of reparation. Much about international law remained unanswered during the tribunal, but read against the backdrop of this conference, one thing stood out to me. International law seemed profoundly ill-equipped to do one of the very simple things that the tribunal did, to invite its participants to trace how they moved through and related to where they were, or put it otherwise, to pay attention to how the color yellow was slightly out of place at the wrong time, and what kind of relationships with that place were needed to repair or to restore the timing so that the change of colors would happen within the right time space. It had its own shortcomings, but what it translated into was a series of encounters between law, literature, stories that did some work in contextualizing and articulating the patterns of the association that demarcated different forms of existing and beings together with the non-human, and to be that through law, not just through cultural patterns, but through some form of law. So it translated into these endless reparative legal acts of making common, or trying to at least do this, or what Marie Petersman refers to as post-human commoning as a verb and not as a noun. Now let us move to the second story, and now we're going up to the international version of this tribunal, being the International Rights of Nature Tribunal. So I'm going to give a little bit more of an academic reflection on this tribunal and ground the legal proceedings that they had, referring back to what I observed in the first tribunal. And then we'll go from there to talk about how this perhaps changed how we think about reparations and territory under international law. So in November 7 in 2017, the International Rights of Nature Tribunal gathered at Landesmuseum in the German city of Bonn. The tribunal members are gathered here to hold what's called opinion hearings, or deliver opinion judgments on issues of environmental justice, including the violation of the rights of nature. And this was held concurrently with the COP23 climate change negotiations, with the intention of offering a different legal response to climate change than the international climate regime. And they've done this in several instances to set up concurrently with the COP negotiations. So it was the fourth time that this tribunal met, but it was the first time that it met after having formally constituted itself in Paris 2 years prior during the COP negotiations there. The hearings in Bonn were inaugurated by the city deputy mayor Reinhard Limbach. Without delving too much into his opening remarks, it was quite astonishing that the tribunal decided to open with this figure. So he had not been involved with the rights of nature movement in any way or form, nor the tribunal. He did not seem very familiar with the tribunal's institutional objectives or aspirations, and also its divergence from the formal established international legal order. So one question that arises then, why would the tribunal, if the objective was to set itself apart from the international legal order, why would this first performative act on the stage of the tribunal, at least in some capacity, be by someone that represented the German state? The answer, I would suggest, lies in how it, on an institutional, legal, and procedural level, seemed to understand law as something related very specifically to and grounded in place. And this answer, I believe, will help us to make sense of how we perhaps should try to approach reparations under international law. So at first glance, this invitation to Limbach might seem as of minor relevance, but the closer we look at the tribunal's procedure, we get a completely different view, or at least a much more complicated picture, in which this invitation itself seemed to be part of a larger attention to how the tribunal itself arrived in this particular place and then conducted itself in this place. On one level, this is expressed in how the tribunal thought about its specific location within the bounds of the city. So the COP23 negotiations were held at the UN campus in the World Conference Center in the old parliamentary quarters, but the Bonn tribunals was set up as this museum, which was located in the center of the city, with its own thematic focus on the cultural memory of the Rhineland-Westphalian region. The tribunal's choice of venue was then materially placed in the city quite differently than the COP23 negotiations. So the UN campus had a very globally oriented spatial formation of how we imagine justice and connections and relations. The museum, on the other hand, was woven into the place and the history of its geographic location, nestled in amongst the architectural, institutional, and bureaucratic fabric of this city. This institution emerged before the German principalities were united into the modern nation state and had over time taken form in response to the grounded political, judicial, and cultural life of the city. Which might seem like a quite minor point, but when we connect it to how the tribunal then proceeded, and the further the tribunal hearings unfolded, what became quite clear was the tribunal was concerned with authority and law, not simply as something that's mapped onto the cartography of the nation state, but something that is in the place where they arrive, but also is related to how people then arrive to the tribunal. So following these welcoming remarks by Limbach, the presiding tribunal president, Dinan Dakota man Tom Goldtooth, proceeded to invite a Sami artist and, importantly, Sami parliamentarian, Åsa Simma, to the tribunal stage. And he noted the following: in our protocols as indigenous peoples, which now I guess in many ways was translated into also figure at the heart of the protocols for the tribunal. Whether we come to someone's homeland, whenever we come to someone's homeland, we look for those people, the regional people, the indigenous people. So she's going to welcome us and we appreciate it, or we appreciate her. So this diplomatic procedure and gesture seems quite strange considering the Sapmi, which is the territory of the Sami people, was located about 2,000 kilometers away from Bonn. But since the Sami people are some of the only indigenous people on the European continent, this recognition of Sami authority and Sami law on the continent actively worked against a larger traditional thought that excludes indigenous laws from the imaginary of law in favor of an international legal order that is neatly organized into territorially bound sovereign nation states, and rather cast indigenous law as strictly a cultural matter. What followed from this was a range of procedural acts in which states and non-state actors in different forms were invited to come and speak at the tribunal, and speak not simply as representatives or concerned individuals, but as representatives of their laws as grounded in specific localities and authorized by the relationships that they had to those specific localities. This even included an invitation as a matter of law to non-human actors to attend the tribunal hearings as indigenous sovereign nations, as if they could hold law and enter into legal relationships with human communities. This offers a quite distinct departure from international law, and now I'll move into the third part of the lecture. Under international law, the environment is often seen as a stable backdrop upon which human dramaturgy plays out, a relationship which is mediated by territory. International law follows a territorial order where the totality of the globe is divided into modern nation states that enjoy sovereignty over territory. And under this order of things, the sovereign state with its territorial bounds is imagined as the only possible legal entity and form of or mode of human organization. As Kate Starr argues, at least since the Island of Palma case, doctrinal treatments of territory tend to take as a natural fact that a state exercises exclusive sovereignty in relation to a portion of the surface of the globe, and focus instead on rules of territorial acquisition and elimination. These territorial accounts, Starr and others suggest, rest on a specific abstraction of the relationship between community, authority, and place, which in the end renders place absent and foregrounds the flatness of the modern state. We might also think here with the work of Stefan Solomon on the contemporary international law of territory, which visualizes how the seeming givenness of this territorial division is deeply linked to anthropocentric and Eurocentric understandings of sedentariness and unsteadiness. Or in law, which is a very interesting argument that's being developed now, or has been developed recently by Daniel Matthews and his study of sovereignty, that the very division of the world into sovereign nation states produces a form of aesthetics that renders us unable to see what might be another cartography, another way of relating to the land. So it produces an anesthetized situation where we are numb in our relationships to each other and the world which we constitute or living together with. Both Starr and Solomon argues that the full extent of this is best visualized by attending to the thick historical doctrinal debates that now seem quite settled, but they shape the contemporary notion of territory under international law. I won't necessarily bore you with going into too much details of this, but I'll make a brief gesture to one account by the Swiss 19th century jurist Johannes Caspar Bluntschli. So in the theory of the state, Bluntschli develops an understanding of the state as a political formation which has come into life as humans manage to what he refers to as transcend a natural state. As he puts it, whilst history explains the organic nature of the state, we learn from it at the same time that the state does not stand on the same grade with the lower organisms of plants and animals, but is of a higher kind. But Bluntschli's notion of the state as having to transcend this animalistic state did not mean that the state was simply an unnatural construction. Quite on the contrary, to Bluntschli, man's ability to organize politically and then transcend this animalistic state was thought to be also part of or indicative of human evolution and progress and human nature. So he noted that due to the fact that man, and he did this through Aristotle, is a political animal, it is also a fact that men will eventually come together in the formation of a state, taking dominion over a defined territory. So what emerges here and in many other accounts is an understanding of the state as a human community which reaches its fullest human form precisely in the moment that it overcomes nature and takes dominion over a distinct enclave or land, or rather when it overcomes its earthly entangled relationships to place and take control over a territory with a population, forms a government, and engages in international relations, which is a reference to the Montevideo Convention and the foundation of what's required for statehood under international law. This account offers a liminal view of this history and this doctrinal debate that now underpin how we think about territory under international law. But it speaks volumes, I think, to what kind of abstraction away from land are we operating with when we operate within the register of territory. So coming back a little bit to where we were before in the beginning, if reparations for climate change is in one way or another about repairing relationships with land and addressing the loss of relations with place, which Marino's poem evokes, then how may this notion of territory shape what kind of repair is possible, and also in the words of Vasuki Nesaya, writing specifically towards reparations, thinkable under international law. Reparations for climate change under international law means various things, depending on how you approach history, international law, the environment, race, and so forth, including, of course, the relationship between all of them. When it comes to climate change, there are multiple different avenues, but one common is to discuss loss and damage compensation. State obligations relating to compensation for loss and damage has long been resisted by wealthy states and avoided within the climate change regime. So these are a couple of slides as well that I'll see if we can, well, I guess this will go up online so people can have a look at it, but they represent different cartographies of how we can map our relationship to the land. Returning back to loss and damage. So the COP27 negotiations led to the establishment of a loss and damage fund, which of course is very welcome. But the regime of compensations tell a particular story about the vernacular of repair that is operationalized through international law. So in her historical account on loss and damage, Julia Demes noted a strong tendency to encapsulate reparations in financial terms. Here, matters of repair are contextualized as solvable principally by financial means rather than cessation of emissions and restitution. And whilst Dem's commentary relates to the Warsaw mechanism, it goes to broader tension associated with the financial logics that sometimes permeates reparations. And I would be interested to hear more about your work on this, Felix, as well. But including also then the desire by many wealthy states to steer clear of any discussion of the law of state responsibility in the ICJ advisory opinion on climate change. We see this very clearly in the context of reparations for slavery, in which financial compensation is consistently resisted on the basis of the principle of intertemporality. But as Vasuki Nesaya stressed, this line of argumentation fundamentally depends on a particular apathy to history. She notes in relationship to Haiti that the sovereign debt that was accrued in order to secure independence was not simply a product of sovereignty, but at the very heart of the conditions of entry into the world of law. And I think we're running slightly out of time. So, okay, but we have a space for conversation after. Right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I might go over a little bit, and then, but let's see if we can perhaps jump ahead a little bit. So the point that she makes is that this debt is odious in nature. So France is not in a position to forgive, but holds obligations of reparation for existing and continuing harm. Similarly, many wealthy states has argued in their submissions to the ICJ advisory opinion that they have no distinctive responsibility for their unique contribution to harm caused by the grossly excessive historical emissions. And that everything relating to climate change should fall under the Paris Agreement. When compensation is accepted as a live possibility, as in the loss and damage debate, it is first and foremost in the language of financial compensation. And whilst this tells us many things, it perhaps specifically brings attention to the slipperiness of compensation as a reparative act. It can draw attention away from reparations as a world-making project that builds institutions, structures, and particularly relationships, some of which we perhaps explored in the beginning, that undo racial inequalities in resources and power and for functional relations with the non-human. Sarah Riley Case makes this clear with a reference to Robin Kelly, noting reparations are never entirely about money. Reparations are foremost a horizon of transformation away from accumulative ways of life that spread from Europe to the world. The way out must generate a new knowledge of we, a new narrative of human, away from the accumulative ways of liberal Homo economicus. And perhaps then this brings us back to where we were in the beginning. So contemporary doctrinal accounts on territory sit on the top of this longer historical debate, which has normalized the Homo economicus as and its accumulative way of life associated with it, which makes the international law of territory, with how it grounds authority over place precisely in extraction and accumulation, and the flatness of legal abstraction rather than the relational, an important part of the problem. It is indeed hard to avoid how territory mediates an authority of a place that fits with the boy's note about whiteness in the soul of white folks. Then always somehow, some way, silently but clearly, I'm given to understand that whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever. So taking the limited depth of international law of territory seriously then might mean, might be at the heart of making visible and hence also possible the kind of reparative projects of hope that we so desperately need. So coming back to Mariner's poem and then thinking back to the tribunals and with the tribunals, it is perhaps the case that the legal compensations and reparations and also territory must be precisely a terrestrial matter, a matter of living in reparative relations with and in place, making common together in everyday acts and with the non-human. And to begin to do so, and I think this is kind of the punchline and the most important aspect, to really begin to attempt to do so through institutional forms and through legal forms and collective organizing rather than simply seen as individual acts. And to then think about how that could actually also be done under international law. What this means for our understanding of reparations, for climate change and to current developments, well, it perhaps means a lot of different things, but one thing that I think it really stresses that is asked us to think carefully about how we then conceptualize and engage with this existing debates around state obligations and reparations that is now very prominent in the legal sphere. And to pay close attention to how place is being evoked, not the least in the submissions and the pleadings by states and other actors for the ICJ advisory opinion on climate change, and how that might shape international law. And there's ample material for this, and I'll kind of conclude now. So in the very first session before the court, Ilian Kiloi, which we have here, representing the Melanesian Spearhead Group, noted the following in his pleadings. Melanesia is a tapestry of diverse people, each with their own cultures, languages, and traditions. But we also share in the word of the Melanesian philosopher Bernard Narcobi, a common cultural and spiritual unity stemming from our interconnectedness with the environment. And then he says, we are placed persons, which means that we are the places, we are the landscape, we are the waters, we are the soil, the stone, and we are the flora and the fauna. We are the weather, the seasons, and the spirits of our ancestral territories. I'll leave that comment for further engagement now in the conversation and going forward. But what I want to really stress is for international lawyers and anyone that works on this matter to take these kind of statements seriously, not simply as a backdrop upon which the real deal legal arguments are actually made, but as part and parcel of legal arguments. And then see it as openings for several questions that at least we international lawyers will hopefully dwell on much more carefully. So can we, in doctrinal terms, speak about place rather than territory as we frame arguments for reparations? And can we then translate that into how we think about the forms of reparations that we imagine? Here I'm thinking with those such as Danish Sheikh's attention to the very reparative life of law, as well as those such as Julian Agin and others from small island communities. And also, of course, the literature that surely all of you are engaging with when it comes to critical geography and so forth. So I'll end with this following note. To get places with reparations for ecological harm, we might need to actively go below territory to places where lightness of doctrine might not be feasible. Because as Natalie Diaz points out in a post-colonial poem by quoting Joseph Brodsky, in such places, darkness restores what light cannot repair. Thank you.